Very good evening from Team NIAS CSP. We welcome you all for yet another Friday lecture. So this time we have a special friend and a colleague of ours, our senior Siddharth, with us. I'll request Meera to please introduce Siddharth and also his topic of the day. Over to you, Meera.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to today's Friday lecture. And it is indeed a pleasure to introduce Siddharth, who is our speaker and colleague, like Niharika mentioned. So, Siddharth is a researcher who works primarily in the area of philosophy of mind. His doctoral research, which he conducted at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, deals with the philosophical problem of consciousness, the question of how we can fit the conscious mind in our picture of reality. While situated in the area of philosophy of mind, his research also delves into other areas such as philosophy of science. His research has been published in the Journal of the Indian Council of Philosophical Research and volumes published by Springer Singapore and Azim Premji University. His work has also been presented in conferences at Sun Yat-sen University, China, and Central European University, Hungary. His PhD, Siddharth completed his master's degree in education, postgraduate diploma in management, and bachelor's in mechanical engineering. So we have quite a scholar here. So it is indeed a pleasure, Siddharth, to have you today. And I remember that the first time I heard you speak was probably in my first year at NIAS. And you were at that time also introducing us to consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness and so forth. And I was just sitting there awestruck, wondering what is all this. And yeah, so it's it's interesting that you are back and you'll be talking about the same again, and I'm looking forward to it. So a warm welcome to you, Siddharth. Over
Thank you,
to you.
Mira, and thank you, Niharika, for the warm welcome and those memories. And hello and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here and to listen to me talk. Shall I start sharing the screen, Niharika?
Yeah,
I can do that,
please.
right? Yeah, just a minute. Mm. So, as Niharika and Mira said, my work is largely situated in philosophy, more specifically in philosophy of mind and certain metaphysical aspects of studying the mind. Uh, so today's lecture is titled "Why Do We Think the Problem of Consciousness is Hard?" As some of you might know, it's quite popular these days to talk about the hard problem of consciousness. So I want to begin the lecture today by introducing what really is this philosophical problem of consciousness. What is this hard problem of consciousness? And using that, motivate the topic of today's talk, which is come to be known as the meta problem of consciousness. It's a meta problem because it's a problem about the problem of consciousness. After that, I shall briefly outline some responses to this meta problem, this problem about the problem of consciousness, and then conclude the talk by briefly outlining an approach which I myself hope to pursue in my research. It is building upon part of the research that I had done as part of the doctoral work here at NIAS. So I shall conclude the talk by outlining what I hope to be working on in addressing the meta problem of consciousness. So, so as I said, I'll begin with briefly outlining what is this whole thing about the philosophy. I mean, why is consciousness such a interesting topic philosophically? It's common to hear people, philosophers and scientists say, and for good reason, to say that consciousness is perhaps the phenomenon about the world that we are all most intimately aware of. We really don't need an introduction in some way to say what consciousness is. I mean, consciousness is part of our mental life. We are all conscious beings, and it's part of every moment of our waking life. So when I sit in the chair and look at the screen, I have a visual experience as of looking at a laptop, and I have this tactile experience of feeling the air around me or touching the chair on which I'm sitting, and also hearing myself talk. All these experiences are, we assume, at least at first pass, are part of our mind, are part of our mental life. So, broadly, the philosophical question is, how do we understand the mind, this mental life, these mental processes, these mental properties, with in relation to the body or bodily processes or physical processes? So that people might ask, what really is the problem in that? So while this has been of philosophical interest across traditions over centuries and probably millennia, in contemporary philosophy of mind, this problem of consciousness has been sort of parsed out in the form of two problems. And this was done in the 90s by the philosopher David Chalmers, who you see there in the picture. He said, okay, the really a lot of scientific work that goes in understanding consciousness, what they do is they try to understand the neural and computational basis of various cognitive processes, such as when I look at a tree, what really happens in our brain, or what are the computational logic of this visual perception, of attention, of memory, or when I cognitively distinguish between a tree and a plant, what is the computational basis of this? He said all these problems are very, very interesting and challenging, but philosophically, he called these the easy problem. And as you notice, I've put the word easy under quotes because they are not really easy. They are all really, really hard and interesting scientific problems. But philosophically, he calls them easy because these are all, we at least have an idea as to how to approach these problems and what the methods are. And he said that the methods of cognitive science, especially cognitive neuroscience, show us a path as to how to proceed to this on these problems. On the other hand, the really hard problem, he said, was the problem of explaining why do all these cognitive processes, or at least most of these cognitive processes, why are they accompanied by an experience? For example, when I look outside the window and pay attention to the tree, why is this cognitive process of looking at the tree? Why is it accompanied by this experience as of a tree? In other words, why does it feel for me some way to look at the tree? Why is this what it is like feeling associated with all these cognitive processes? In short, this is the problem of explaining experiences. How do experiences arise from these physical cognitive processes, presumably that occur in our brain and the body? So, this problem is what he called the hard problem of consciousness. So, as I said, uh, in some sense, such this problem of placing consciousness or the conscious mind in relation to the body is an old philosophical problem. And what Chalmers did was, in some sense, to contextualize it in contemporary language and to place it in response as a challenge to contemporary scientific theories of consciousness. So this distinction is quite important and influential, and it has become commonplace to talk about. Okay, philosophers talk about the hard problem of consciousness, whereas a lot of scientists talk about the easy problem, though they themselves don't admit that they don't want to call it the easy problem of consciousness because there is a sort of stigma attached to calling it the easy problem. But this distinction between the hard and the easy problems of consciousness has become quite influential and commonplace in philosophy of mind and in consciousness studies. Broadly, from the history of philosophy, if you see, there are broadly, very, very broadly, three kinds of responses to the hard problem of consciousness. And in the last century, especially since the 20th century, with the tremendous progress of science, what has become the orthodoxy is the view called physicalism or materialism, or approaches which seek to explain all reality, including our mental reality, including consciousness, in terms of the underlying physical basis. So these theories say that all that exists are, in some sense, physical processes, bodily processes or brain processes, and functions associated with them, and everything, including this experientiality of our mental life, is explained in terms of these material processes. There are various kinds of views here, and together we can broadly call them as either physicalism or materialism. For they say all that exists are physical and physical processes and physical phenomena. On the other hand, an influential view in Western philosophy, especially in since the early modern times, is the view called dualism. I'm sure all of you have heard of the French philosopher René Descartes of the 1600s, who famously said that the mind, or the seat of the self, or the soul, or the seat of consciousness, is an entity which is distinct from the body, which is separate from the physical reality. While Descartes' views themselves are not very popular these days, his line of thinking or dualistic intuitions have a tremendous influence and are quite influential even in shaping the discourse today. So broadly, dualistic views are those views which say that experiences and experiential entities are distinct from physical entities. And the third kind of view, broadly speaking, are the views called idealism, which say that it's not really the mind which is a problem. But what it says is all of reality is to be understood in terms of our mental experiences. In some sense, idealistic views hold that it is the mind or the mental phenomena which is fundamental, and also the ground for our knowledge of the physical world. So, what idealistic views do is foreground the mental life and try to explain physical reality in terms of mental reality. So, these are really broad categories, and there are various kinds of views within each. But I thought I'll just introduce the topic here. Uh, Most philosophical problems, it would be fair to say, are extremely contentious, and philosophers like to debate and oppose and nitpick on these. But the problem of consciousness, or more broadly, the mind body problem, is especially contentious. And there, even since David Chalmers famously drew the distinction between the hard and the easy problems in 1995, there has been nothing like a consensus on how do we even resolve the hard problem. So there are the dualists who are in their camp, there are the materialists, and there are various other people. There is no even agreement between the dualists or even within the materialists as to how do we solve this problem. Um, so what Chalmers very recently did is he wanted to understand why is this problem considered so hard? Why do people think that this problem is so hard? And this gave rise to what he himself called in 2018 the meta problem of consciousness, because it's a problem about the problem of consciousness, and hence meta. So he asked this question: why do we think that the problem of consciousness, the philosophical problem of consciousness, are hard to explain? So this is a broad question. So what really is he asking for? What does he seek to explain in asking this question? So consider, for example, a non-academic, a common man, when they are asked to reflect upon their own experiences. Again, let us use a very everyday experience of looking outside the window in at a green tree. When we ask them, even a common person, to reflect upon what do they think about the nature of reality of their experience of the tree, it's likely that they say, oh, that is part of the mental life, which is not amenable to, which is not really part of physical reality. So even intuitively, it seems like we all form judgments that the problem of consciousness is something tricky, that mental reality, that the conscious mind is somehow different from the physical. So when in asking the meta problem of consciousness, in posing the problem, what Chalmers is asking is how do we explain these judgments, problem reports about consciousness? Why do we judge that the problem of consciousness is hard? Or more specifically, why do we judge that physical explanations do not suffice to explain consciousness? And why are such intuitions widely shared? So he himself posed this problem, hoping that if we understand, or if we try to answer this meta problem, try to understand why do we think the problem of consciousness is hard, we could make progress in addressing the main problem, the problem of consciousness itself. So this was, in some sense, Chalmers' attempt to at making headway or breaking the impasse in addressing the philosophical problem of consciousness. So, what I want to do over the next 20 minutes is briefly outline how the various stakeholders in the problem of consciousness, as I said, there are broadly these physicalists, there are these idealists, there are these dualists. How would each of them, from their own perspective, not only explain their theory of consciousness, which is the hard problem, response to the hard problem, but how would they explain why we think the problem of consciousness is hard? And hopefully, and this is while these they may be distinct questions, they are closely interrelated, and in some sense, as Chalmers says, it's hopeful that if a theory of consciousness is also able to explain why we face challenges in responding to the problem of consciousness, that is, respond to the meta problem, it adds weight and credibility to their own theory. So, briefly, I want to spend some time outlining how the various schools of thought might respond to the meta problem of consciousness. So, let me begin with what for a long time was part of the scientific orthodoxy, that in some sense the mind or mental processes and sensations or consciousness or experiences are identical to brain processes. Uh, Such views were extremely popular in the 1950s, and among the pioneers of such views in philosophy were two Australian philosophers called Place and Smart. Broadly, the identity theory holds that consciousness and sensations are identical to brain processes. And an example of such an identity is they say sensations are identical to brain processes, just like how lightning is ultimately just identical to electrical discharge in the sky during thunderstorms. While we might use different concepts to talk about lightning and electrical discharge, what the philosopher UT Place said is they are not ultimately distinct, they are ultimately identical. Similar sensations such as the sensation of pain is ultimately identical to a brain process. Now, we might have read scientific projects to identify which brain process they are identical to, but that's just a scientific empirical problem. There is no real philosophical problem, or so he said. So that's his identity theory. And I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of his theory, but I just want to outline how would such a theorist respond to the meta problem, or the problem of why we think the problem of consciousness is hard. And Place himself said that we think the problem of consciousness is hard. He didn't say it in as many words, but in effect, that's what he said, is because we commit what he called the phenomenological fallacy. Now, what is this phenomenological fallacy? He said, we all commonly, normal people and academic scientists and philosophers, commit the mistake of supposing that when someone describes their experience, they are not really describing an object out there in the world. So when I say that the tree is green, we assume that we are not really describing the greenness of the tree, but only describing how the tree appears to us, how greenness appears to us, how it appears in what he calls this internal cinema or internal television screen. So this is what he called as a phenomenological fallacy. In some sense, what he says is we have a tendency to subjectivize all objective knowledge. While what we are really talking about is the property, the greenness of the tree, we tend to assume that we are talking about our experience of greenness. And we commit this fallacy, what he called the phenomenological fallacy. So the meta problem of consciousness, according to an identity theorist, would not be why do we think the problem of consciousness is hard, but the question of why do we commit the phenomenological fallacy. Now, somebody like UT Place would say that if we understand why we commit the phenomenological fallacy, we will understand why we think the problem of consciousness is so hard. So this is how an identity theorist might respond to the meta problem. So let's move on to another kind of materialist. In some sense, they are a slightly more radical school of materialism, which has become especially popular in the 90s and since the 90s. What they say, I mean, the view is called illusionism, and its most famous proponent is the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, who we see in the picture there. He's a very well known philosopher and cognitive scientist. What they say is that what we think to be consciousness or experiences, or this whole thing called the personal level, the self, or whatever we associate with the personal mental life, all of these are just illusions. They are not, in the sense, ultimately real. So, an important difference between the illusionist and the identity theorist, the identity theorist, like Place, do not deny the reality of consciousness. Rather, they say this real consciousness is identical to brain processes. On the other hand, illusionists such as Daniel Dennett or the British philosopher Keith Frankish, they say that consciousness is an illusion. And so, for example, Daniel Dennett says that we are all ultimately just robots made out of robots, made of robots. That is, he says we all that exists are just mechanisms of our body, brain mechanisms and mechanisms within mechanisms. That's what he means when he says we are all robots, and we all manage in concert to create the user illusion of a conscious person, of a conscious mental life. So the whole thing that we call a subjective reality is for somebody like Daniel Dennett an illusion. So, if for such a theorist, the problem of explaining why we think the heart problem is really so hard then becomes the problem of explaining how is this user illusion of a conscious person, how is this illusion of a subjective life at all generated. So, once such an illusionist theory is able to give a satisfactory explain of how the illusion is created, then there would remain, if at all they are able to give this satisfactory uh, explanation, there would not remain a further hard problem of consciousness, or so they claim. So this is how the second kind of more radical kind of materialist would respond to the meta problem of consciousness. And closely related to this uh, is a response given by two cognitive neuroscientists, Hakwan Lau and Matthias Michel. So what they say is this illusion of a problem is really the remnant or the side effect of the current lack of empirically adequate scientific theories. So compared to various other branches of biology or even neuroscience, while we understand at least partly how attention works or how memory works, we do not have empirically adequate or theories which can make successful predictions about conscious mental states. And it is because of this lack of such adequate theories that we seem to think that the problem of consciousness is hard. So, on this, if this hypothesis were to be taken seriously, then the problem of explaining why the consciousness problem is hard translates into the problem of explaining why does consciousness science lag behind other areas in neuroscience? Why do not we have empirically adequate theories of consciousness? And Law and Michel have a very interesting response to this question. And it's quite interesting because while they themselves are cognitive neuroscientists, they resort a socio-historical response and appeal to the social history of the field of consciousness science itself, which I'll briefly outline. So this is the scheme that they have. So they say that there is this phenomena which happens, that where there is a topic or any area which is considered scientific taboo, like consciousness science, for a long time in the 20th century, because of the advent of behaviorism in the early parts of the 20th century, consciousness was not considered as a legitimate field of study. There was, in some sense, a taboo around a scientific study of consciousness, especially in the middle part of the 20th century. So, when such scientific taboo uh, prevails around a topic, what they say, studying the history of science, is that it tends to attract certain charismatic figures, what they call gurus, to the field. And what these gurus do are propound revolutionary views. And in some sense, by gurus, what they mean are really charismatic figures, really popular figures who make their name in another field, but then enter a new field and propound revolutionary views. So they say that consciousness studies in the 20th century itself was a fertile ground for such charismatic figures to enter, and they give a whole list of people, Nobel laureates, for example, people such as Sir John Eccles or Roger Sperry, later Sir Roger Penrose, who was a physicist who got into consciousness studies by the end of the 20th century. So what they say, these are all scholars who made their name, who did very important work in other fields such as physics or in neurophysiology, but were not really cognitive neuroscientists. And what they did was they suddenly, once they established and made a name for themselves in other fields, towards the end of their careers, they entered the field of consciousness studies and they started propounding revolutionary views. Most importantly, they said such views did not have any empirical ways to validate them. So, in some sense, they were outside the bounds of science. And now, when such charismatic figures enter the field, what they say is this leads to a whole process where there are others who sort of tag along with these people, and that in turn adds more credibility to these revolutionary views. And this whole thing leads to a vicious cycle where Law and Michel claim leads to a breakdown of normal scientific practice. Most importantly, it leads to a breakdown of normal peer review and leads to a breakdown of public funding. And there is a whole socio-historical phenomena which they explain. But broadly, this, they say, is what has happened to the field of consciousness studies, more importantly, the science of consciousness studies in the last 50, 60 years. And because such a phenomenon has happened, this, they say, lies below the reason why consciousness science lags behind in other areas. The fact that such charismatic figures have entered and it has led to a breakdown of it being part of the more mainstream scientific establishment. And this, they say, is the reason why consciousness science lags behind, which ultimately leads to a lack of empirically adequate theories, which again now leads us to think that consciousness is a really hard problem and physical explanations do not suffice. This sort of fits along with the kind of theories that illusionists such as Dennett themselves say. So this is just, again, I'm not getting into whether Lau and Michel's theories themselves are the pros and cons of the theories, but I just want to put it out there saying that this is one way to respond to the meta problem of consciousness. Now let's move to slightly more philosophical or metaphysical theories, which are not really popular among the scientists. As I said, dualism has a venerable history in Western and other Eastern as well as Indian philosophies. While there are not too many dualists in contemporary philosophy, there are quite a few. And one of the more popular version of dualism is to say that experiences is a second kind of non-physical entities which interact with physical entities through laws of causation. And our challenge for such a view would be to say that to specify at least broadly what how these laws of causation might be. So Chalmers himself, when he first proposed the hard problem of consciousness, was a proponent of dualism as well, and a more a contemporary proponent is the philosopher Bradford Sad. Now, what Sad himself says is that such non-physical experiential entities, the second kind of entities, the dual entity, has a causal role in explaining our intuitions about why the problem of consciousness is hard. So, the meta problem then for the dualist is not really to explain why do we think now to explain why do we think the problem of consciousness is hard. They'll have to explain the following thing. This might be a little tricky, so I'll spend a minute on this. So they'll have to explain there is this challenge of for such dualists who say that the mental world, the second kind of world, interacts with the physical world in explaining a peculiar kind of harmony. Now, what is this harmony between? This harmony, they say, they will have to be committed to is between two worlds. One is the world of causation, because they hold that these mental entities have a causal influence on physical entities, and between the world of reasons. Now, consider this example. When I look again, the same example of when I look outside the window and look at a green tree, I have an experience of a green tree. Now, the dualist would say this experience is a second kind of entity and has a causal role in my following the belief that there is a green tree. So it has a causal, the experience of the green tree has a causal role in the belief that there is a green tree. Now, not only does it have a causal role, it also seems to justify by the norms of everyday reason that if I look at a tree, I ought to form the belief that there is a green tree. So the problem that faces a dualist is to explain, okay, there is this world of reasons and there is this world of causes. How is there such a harmony between the very fact that uh, the experiences of a green tree not only causes you to form the belief, it also justifies by the norms of reason? Or the other way of putting the question is, how is the fact that how do we explain the fact that an experience causes only those effects which they seem to justify by the norms of reason? So the meta problem of consciousness for the dualist is to explain this harmony. More specifically, is how does such a harmony between the world of causes and the world of reason exist when we form judgments about our own consciousness? So that is the a meta problem that is facing interaction as dualists. And the philosopher Bradford Sad himself has a very interesting response to this, where he says that it is a fundamental law of nature. If you're a dualist, then you'll have to adopt a fundamental law of nature, a fundamental teleological law. And by teleological, he means a law which specifies a purpose for causation. He says there's a fundamental law which which will have to be the case that experiences only cause those effects which they can also rationalize. So what he in effect he says is that this harmony between reasons as causes would have to be a fundamental law about the law of nature, of which mental world is a part. And this fundamental law in some sense guides the kinds of things that experiences can cause. So such a fundamental law might be counterintuitive, but that's the approach that dualists have to take to sort of respond to the meta problem of consciousness. So then, before I get into my own, what I think is the best response to the meta problem of consciousness, I'll finally sort of outline how an idealist might respond to the meta problem of consciousness. Idealism, as I said, is in general refers to a family of views which says that the mental is fundamental, and the mental plays an irreducible role in explaining or accounting for the physical world itself. The most extreme forms of idealism is to hold that all that exists is one large cosmic mind, which has a venerable tradition both in Western and Indian philosophy, and is also taken seriously by a lot of contemporary philosophers. But one version of idealism that I would just want to touch upon here is that of the famous German philosopher who's considered often considered the most important figure in Enlightenment philosophy of European philosophy, that is Immanuel Kant. So, what Kant himself famously said is that our knowledge of the world is completely restricted to our representations of the world. In some sense, we can never escape our representations of the world and attain knowledge of how the world in itself is. In some sense, we are always bounded by the limits of our own representational capacities. So even when I look at an object, I can never know what the object in itself is. I can at best know how I represent the object. So this kind of idealism, which he called transcendental idealism, because all our knowledge of the world is ultimately reduced to our mental representations of the world. And Kant also proposed that we are all under an illusion, not any normal illusion, but what he called the transcendental illusion, an illusion which arises due to the nature of human reason itself, wherein we have this propensity, we have this urge to look for objective knowledge that can ground all other subjective knowledge. That is, Kant himself said that all we can have is subjective knowledge. All that only knowledge we can have of the world is of our subjective representations of the world. Yet we always have this urge and we always have this tendency to objectify the subjective knowledge and to look for and claim knowledge of the world in itself. So I mean, while ultimately all this, simply put, all this means is Kant says that when we look at a tree, we forget that we only know the represent how we represent this object called a tree, and we tend to think that our knowledge of the tree is objective knowledge. And this illusion or this limitation of our knowledge, that the fact that we can only, our knowledge is always limited to our representations of the world, for Kant, lies at the bottom of why we think the mind body problem or the problem of consciousness, it was not called the problem of consciousness then, why the mind body problem is a problem at all. So just read what he says. He says that if we compare the thinking I, that is the soul or the seat of consciousness, um, not with how the world in itself is, but only with, I mean, if we compare it not with our representations of matter, but how the world in itself is, which we can never know. But if we do at all know how the world in itself is, Kant claims that this whole question of what the mind is relation to the body, can the mind be identical to the body, would not arise. So for Kant, this lack of knowledge, I mean, this inescapable lack of knowledge of human beings, of the world as it is, lies at the bottom of this whole mind body problem of, and if due to some magic, if we were to attain knowledge of the things in themselves, of how the world really is and not just how we represent the world, this whole mind body problem for Kant would dissolve. So this is his idealist views. So far I've outlined kinds of two extreme kinds of views. One which says all that exists are is the material world, and once we explain certain material mechanisms, this illusion of consciousness would go away. On the other hand, somebody like Kant or contemporary adherents of Kantian philosophy might claim that once we give up this urge for objective knowledge and realize that we do not have knowledge of the world as it is, this whole mind body problem would resolve. So the approach that I myself want to take is can be seen as some kind of middle path between these two. So I'll quickly wrap this up in 5 minutes. So it is based on an approach called structural realism or broadly structuralism. So what does structuralism say? Structuralism says that our knowledge of the physical world is limited to its real structure. And when it says it's limited to its structure, what is what it also says is that we are ignorant of certain kinds of properties of the world. More importantly, we do not know how the world in itself is. We only know the structure of the world. So what really is structure? Structure the structuralists say, can be understood as abstract properties. That is the logical and mathematical properties of physical phenomena. That is, when I look, a structuralist would say that when I look at a cube of ice, what I really know about this cube of ice is only the mathematical properties of its shape, the logical properties of how its property of, say, solidity relates to various other properties. So, in short, what they say is we know only the abstract logical and mathematical properties of the physical world. We do not know what, say, the cube of ice or any other physical entity over and above these logical mathematical properties are. That is, we do not know the what it is, the intrinsic nature of physical entities. So structuralism, unlike the materialist, says that we know only the structure, but unlike a Kantian idealist, says that we at least know the real structure. It's not that we know only how we represent the physical world, but we know its real structure. So, on a structuralist view, the problem of why we think the problem of consciousness is really the problem of this ignorance of the intrinsic nature of physical entities. And a structuralist would claim that it is because we do not know the intrinsic nature of physical entities that we think that the problem of consciousness is hard. So that is the broad approach a structuralist can take. But the challenge is to explain how does this limited knowledge of the physical world really lead to the problem intuitions. Why does the fact that we do not know the intrinsic nature of the physical world lead to these problem intuitions about the problem of consciousness? So the approach that I want to take is based on the research that I conducted, at least part of the research that I conducted as part of my PhD here at NIAS. Uh, so the main sort of insight from that research was that while the structuralist claims, and for good reason, that our knowledge of the physical world is restricted to its abstract structure, that is its logico-mathematical properties, it cannot strictly be the case. It cannot be strictly be the case that we know only the structure and nothing else about the physical world. Rather, we know something else, little more than the structure. We also know that the structure is instantiated by concrete entities. We may not know what a cuboidal object in itself is, that is, a box in itself is, but we know its structure and we know that it's a concrete entity. But how do we know it's concrete, or what is this idea of concreteness that we have? In a paper that I published last year, I argue that this knowledge of concreteness is based on our knowledge of the intrinsic nature of our own mental life or the real nature of our own experiences. So the argument really is that while we know only the structure of the physical world, we know the real nature of our own experiences. And once we accept that, we have an idea of concreteness, and we know that the structure of the physical world, the structure which we associate with the physical world, is initiated by concrete entities. So the key upshot or the takeaway from the study was that our structural knowledge of the physical world is ultimately grounded on the, our knowledge of the real nature of experiences. So we can call this the experiential basis of structural knowledge of the physical world. And I would like to argue that our problem intuitions about the problem of consciousness arises because we fail at times to recognize the experiential basis of our structural knowledge. So when we fail to recognize that our knowledge of the physical world is ultimately grounded on our real knowledge of the real nature of experiential properties, we commit what I call the physicalist fallacy, the mistaken belief that one knows something non-structural about the physical world, independent of one's knowledge of the real nature of our own experiences. So the real meta problem, or to explain why we think the problem of consciousness is hard, on this structuralist approach, we need to explain why do people commit the physicalist fallacy? Why do people, scientists, philosophers, or anybody, tend to mistakenly think that we know something non-structural about the physical world, which is not grounded on our knowledge of our own experiences? So that is what I would like to say is the real meta problem, not really the problem of explaining why we think the problem of consciousness is hard. And two slightly more speculative things of how we can move forward on this is that we can seek to answer two empirical questions. One is this whole thing of idea, I mean, the whole structuralist approach is based on a distinction between structural and intrinsic properties. And this is a distinction that philosophers have come up with based on their reflection and work, and it's not something that we intuitively associate, or do we? So an investigation into how do folk conceptions in our own everyday psychology across cultures, do we at all draw a distinction broadly, something like between the intrinsic or the real nature versus the structural or the relational nature of entities? More specifically, um, do various scientists and in their various physical sciences, do they draw a distinction between these intrinsic and structural properties? And if so, how is this different from how philosophers, more specifically philosophers of science themselves, draw a distinction between intrinsic and structural properties? And the second way to move ahead on this is based on a phenomenological inquiry. So you could probably take a minute to read that quote by the philosopher of science, Grover Maxwell. So he says that it seems undeniable that some kind of realism or naive realism or some form of direct realism, that is the view that we are in looking at an object in perception, we are directly aware of it, is built into our everyday thinking. And this tendency to think of the world in this naive manner is sort of programmed to us from birth. So, and it is this that leads to a lot of problems. So, the phenomenological inquiry that could help us, as structuralists, move ahead in addressing the meta problem is to study our own experiences, our own phenomenology, and look at how our physical entities represented in our experiences. How so? What is it about our nature of a phenomenological representation of physical entities that leads to certain intuitions about our physical entities? So the sort of assumption here is that it is our representation in our own phenomenology of physical entities that leads to the mistaken belief that we know something non-structural about the physical entities. So this phenomenological inquiry is another way to move ahead on the structuralist project of responding to the meta problem of consciousness. So with that, I conclude what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddharth.
Yeah.
If you can please stop sharing your screen.
Just a minute. Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Now the floor is open to questions. You can either type it out in the chat box or raise your hand. So the raise hand button is on in some of the Zoom apps. It's actually available in the lowermost panel. In the reaction button, you can easily find raise hand, or in the participant panel at the end, you can find it. We'll start with Mira's comments, as she's the chairperson of today's lecture. Meera Kumar Menon is also a research scholar with Team CSP, and she's working on Mantravada tradition, and she's also a literature and a psychology student. So, Meera, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Niharika, and thank you, Siddharth, for another lecture on consciousness. I think in the beginning, the problem of consciousness was hard. It's still hard, but probably a little simpler for us now that we have been hearing it.
Hopefully.
Yeah,
It's probably just familiarity, not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is what it is.
Yeah.
So thank you for that lecture. And I mean, I don't have any questions as such about consciousness or the meta problem, since we are discussing that a lot. I had a very mainstream question, probably, that which is not related, but this is something that I have also wanted to ask you for the last 2 years. Why did an engineer start thinking about, I believe you were an engineer, so why did an engineer start thinking about consciousness, and what piqued your interest to do a PhD in something as, I would say, unapproachable to most people as consciousness and philosophy? What made you do a research in consciousness?
Okay. I mean, that's a little off to this thing, but I mean, to quickly to say, there is no real very interesting answer to this, except that I did after my engineering, I did my Masters of Arts in Education, and where I was first introduced to philosophy, and I got reading about philosophy of mind, and that's how I developed an interest in this. There is no other very, so to say, one particular moment that I mean, that caused me an interest on it. I think it was slightly a more boring route of while in my MA, I was just reading and there were a couple of good teachers who motivated me to take this up, and that's how I got interested. There is there is no real very interesting answer to that question, so to say.
Okay. All right. So maybe we can perhaps take a
Yeah,
couple of
yeah,
questions.
sure.
I mean, I have been wondering since we have been doing this for quite some
Mm,
time, and consciousness is
okay.
definitely a subject of interest for all
Mm,
of us. We'll take a couple of other
mm,
questions.
Um, the first comment is by Pooja Soni.
mm.
Ma'am, if you're here, would you like to ask? I'm trying to unmute you. Okay. I'll just read out a comment. I think
Mm,
it's difficult to unmute her. Meta problem is a problem for psychologists because it asks how the mind of an infant develops into an adult mind who thinks abstractly. You could be a physicalist, idealist, dualist,
mm.
etc. You will still have a definition, defined definition of consciousness. Okay, this comment is okay, and the meta problem would be the answer how your mind has developed to think about it in the first place. I okay, Siddharth, do you want to comment on
Yeah,
this
I
or?
can maybe quickly comment on that. Thank you, ma'am, for that insight. It is true that the meta problem is partly a problem for psychologists, in the sense that they could trace and explain how the mind of how through developmental psychologists, especially to say how do infants develop certain ways of representing the world and representing their own minds, and how does this development explain the problem of why we think the problem of consciousness exists. While that is true, another sort of parallel view is to give an evolutionary explanation, is to say that it is not, I mean, to trace the growth not from an infant to an adult, but to the evolutionary growth of human species themselves, and give an explanation, evolutionary explanation of why we represent our own mental life in a particular way, and then use that to explain, answer the meta problem of consciousness. While these are all true, this whole debate between from the perspective of a physicalist, idealist, dualist is in some sense slightly more basic. The way, if you take a physicalist stance, a developmental psychologist might approach the problem itself in a different way. uh, on the other hand, if they take a dualist stance, they might respond to, I mean, the question that they ask, while they seek to explain the developmental psychology from an infant to an adult itself, might be slightly different, and that's what I sought to sort of outline in the presentation itself. But as you say, this empirical approach of studying the developmental psychology plays a very key important role. So even in my own structuralist approach, when I said when we could explain how we represent physical objects, there is a developmental psychologist could seek to explain how are physical objects represented in different stages of a human being's life, and how does this developmental history play a role in our intuitions about consciousness.
Okay. Thanks for that. We'll just take up some of the questions together, then we can answer them
Yeah, sure.
because it'll be better to hear out more questions. And so I'll request before you ask your question, you can just give a one-liner or two-liner introduction about yourself. That'll be great. So the first question is by Narsimha Murthy. Sir, I'm trying to unmute you. You can briefly ask your question.
Yeah, like my name is Narsimha Murthy. Thank you, sir, for your lecture. My question is like the scope of consciousness in this, like in your topic today. Is it only like is it limited only to empirical, like means seeing or seeing or touching or listening to, or like the scope is more, so on a different level, because on the empirical level I understand the consciousness is like it's only the outer level of the consciousness,
Yeah.
outer layer, like yeah, consciousness has multiple layers as far as whatever little I know. So I thought so you
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Now the next is a question by Mr. Arun Dev. Sir, you're already unmuted. If you could.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'm an artist, so I'm neither here nor there. I would like to know how would you see it in the light of relativity or quantum mechanics? Like, as far as I could understand as an artist, the whole idea of time. I think both the special theory and general relativity have proven that, in a way, it is proven physically, theoretically, mathematically that all times are eternally present in a different dimension. There exists a fourth dimension. So the way we experience time is our limitation. And if you take, for instance, a light particle, if you are a light particle, from the perspective of a light particle, it entering into your eye, it is in the same time when it was made. If it was made during the Big Bang, or if you believe in Big Bang, but exists no time for the light particle. Uh, and it also proves that there exists a fourth dimension, which we have no idea. We don't have any experience of that fourth dimension. And of course, quantum physics says that somehow this consciousness is wired uh, to our observation. It changes when we observe. So how would you see that?
Okay.
Thank you, sir, for the question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. The next question is by Sid S. That's the name I can hear actually
Hello.
read out. Yeah, please.
Yes, my name is Siddesh. So
Okay.
I was wondering why topics from this ancient Indian literature and that was like what are your opinions on these topics, like the study of consciousness by ancient Indian scriptures and other sources.
Okay. Thank you. Uh, I'll request Mr. Gautam Ghosh to please ask his question.
Thank you, Siddharth. I am from Patna, Bihar. I'm an independent researcher in the field of consciousness studies. Your structural response of meta problem was, why do people commit the physicalist fallacy? So isn't it the same approach a Vedantist would take?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Siddharth, do you want to
I'll probably
answer to these
quickly.
questions? Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for your very interesting and insightful questions. And I hope I can at least partly ostend towards how one could respond to these queries. The first question by Mr. Narasimhamurthy was asking about what is the scope of consciousness in my own discussion, which is really a question about the definition, sir. So while most of the examples I gave were of perceptual consciousness, because those are in some sense very easily understandable to us, by consciousness or by experience, I am not referring to any one particular kinds of experience. It could be experience of thought, or it could be experiences when we are in altered states of consciousness, and when we are non-waking states, like experience we have in sleep. So it is in some sense any phenomena or any part of our mental life where we have a what it is like feel. So that's what I mean by consciousness. It just so happened, and perhaps I should be a little careful there. Well, I was using examples which refer to perceptual consciousness because those are in some sense most easy to understand. Regarding the question of other levels of consciousness, that itself is a further question which certain schools of philosophy might subscribe to, whereas certain others might not. So that I really don't want to get into that here now. So the second question by Mr. Arun Dev regarding how do the developments in 20th century physics, in relativity, quantum mechanics, etc., bear upon the question of consciousness broadly, if I can summarize your questions itself that way, and especially how does it bear upon the question of objective reality and things like that. In some sense, in short, I don't think I have too much to say that because I'm not a physicist and I am not too well versed in the theories of physics themselves. But there have been lots of attempts at trying to sort of seek a response to this whole problem of consciousness from the perspective of physics. As I said, Roger Penrose, who is a famous mathematical physicist himself, came up with a theory he and the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff came up with the theory that there are certain processes in certain parts of our brain called microtubules, and here I'm not very sure because I'm not very knowledgeable about these fields, is that it is certain quantum phenomena in the microtubules of the brain that are the basis of consciousness or things like that. So that, so as you note, there are, as you yourself noted, there seems to be some work going on between theories in physics and theories of consciousness, but I really can't throw too much light on it because of the limitations of my own knowledge. But that's a very interesting sort of line that a lot of physicists and philosophers have taken. The third question and the fourth question, which are really in some sense similar, because those by Mr. Siddesh and Mr. Gautamhosh ask what, how would various schools in Indian philosophy, or what they call ancient Indian knowledge systems, respond. So again, in this presentation, I have not really got into that because that would require a lot of challenges in integrating views from two two slightly different traditions. But all I can say is that there are various different Indian schools of philosophy, Vedanta, and the various sub schools, Advaita Vedanta or Vasishtha Advaita, all have their own theories of consciousness or theories of the place of the mind in relation to the body. On the other hand, schools such as Nyaya are dualists, whereas the school of Sankhya are also can be interpreted as certain kinds of dualism, and all of them have their own, would have very different theories of explaining why we think this problem of consciousness is hard. I mean, they may not directly respond to this question because the question is a slightly more contemporary question, but one could respond to them from the perspective of a Vedantin or from the perspective of a Nayayika and so on. Again, I really can't get into it here given the scope of the presentation and my own limitations in knowledge, but one particular view I could perhaps briefly outline is how would a Advaita Vedantin respond to this question of this? Is it the Advaita Vedanta, the school itself has a very well developed theory given their own metaphysics of this whole theory of Maya, of the world being in some sense a cosmic illusion, and they have certain posits to explain why we human beings in some sense suffer from this illusion of the physical world, and what causes this illusion, their whole theory of Vidya and Maya. And in some sense, in short, an Advaita Vedantin could respond that it is because that we are under this cosmic illusion of Maya, or we are victims of Avidya or ignorance, that we tend to think that there is a physical world which is separate from the ultimately real non-dual entity which they call as Brahman. So, so that is how an Advaita Vedantin might interpret and respond to this problem of meta problem of consciousness. So the structuralist view itself is not the same as the Vedantin view, because the Vedantin metaphysics itself is very different in the sense that they say the ultimately real entity is non-dual, whereas a structuralist would say uh, our knowledge of the physical world or the entities identified by the various physical signs are all ultimately fundamentally real, just that our knowledge of those entities is restricted to their structure. So unlike the Advaita Vedantin, they would not deny that those are not ultimately real. So in some sense, a structuralism is a part materialism, where they say the material entities or the physical entities identified by science and the physical properties identified by science are real. So in that sense, it's different from a Vedantin. So.
Okay, as we're running a little short of time, there are a couple more questions in the chat box. We can also take up them on the WhatsApp groups. Please don't worry. We actually open up the WhatsApp group for further Q&A, and Siddharth will be answering to your questions there also. And we'll just take up one last question, I think, by Sharmishta Dhar. Then I'll come back to you, Meera. Okay, ma'am.
Yes, I'm
Please
here.
go on.
Yes, since I asked this, raise my hand towards the tail end of the presentation. I would be try to be as brief as possible. My question is, since you actually in during your presentation you alluded to the illusionism of consciousness, and this reminded me of cognitive psychologist Daniel Wagner's the work Illusion of Conscious Will, which actually proposed that what actually Daniel didn't also try to put forward, that our brains do all the work, and the consciousness is just the conscious yes, the consciousness is just an exposed factor, a factor actually. I mean, the brain actually does, the neurophysiological processes actually initiate all our actions and all our mental states and events. But if that is the case, if brains do all the work, my question is, my question to you is, when we are acting, we have this feeling of doing it at volition, intention. The concept of intentions, decisions, are these also the product of the brain? Are these also massive illusions? Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I'll respond to that, Niharika.
Yeah, sure,
Yeah.
Siddharth.
Thank you, ma'am, for a very interesting question. And as you rightly said, the cognitive psychologist Daniel Wagner does say that the conscious will is an illusion. His views can be understood as a subset of the larger project of illusionism, where say it is not just conscious will, but any conscious experience, the experience, the feel of pain, or the feel of thinking, or the feel of reminiscing, all of these are all illusions, and all that exists are physical brain functions, with extremely complex brain functions, and we just happen to represent them in a particular way, and it is this representation which leads to these illusions. So specifically, an illusionist would explain conscious will also as that when I think that I want to stretch my hand and I actually stretch my hand, there are just such brain processes which are represented in my cognitive system as consciously willing to extend my hand. So to answer your question, when we act and we experience, what they would say, this experience is an illusion, and it all that needs to be explained is why do we represent certain cognitive processes as, why do we represent it this way? Why do we represent it as the willing or the intention to stretch your hand or the intention to go drink water? So all that, for an illusionist, all that needs to be explained is this representation, and there is no real. And once this is explained, there is nothing more left to be explained according to the illusionist, because this experience of willing, the experience of having an intention itself is an illusion, or so they would say.
Okay, thanks, Siddharth. I'll request Meera. Yeah, Meera, please go on.
Yeah, thank you, Niharika. I was just telling her that I had another question, and now that Sharmishta ma'am has sort of asked it, I will just extend it. Uh, Probably, perhaps not from the illusionist perspective, but when we come across the study of consciousness, one of the first things we read or hear is that consciousness is the consciousness of something. So, and intentionality plays a very important role there. So, according to you, uh, intentionality, does it somehow also have or presuppose an agent or agency, and does is intentionality capable of manifesting a consciousness? Would you think of intentionality as merely a feature of consciousness, or perhaps also as something that constitutes consciousness? How do you look at intentionality that way? And also, perhaps I'm making a categorical error here, but we have plenty of theories about how intentionality then gives way to manifestation and so forth. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Mira, for a very interesting question. And in some sense, your question really gets to the heart of a matter of a wedge in consciousness studies itself. To take your latter question, you were asking, is intentionality really the basis of consciousness, or is it the mark of consciousness, or all conscious states intentional? And it's a large part of contemporary philosophy of mind define consciousness that way. Conscious states are those states which are intentional, which are always about something, and that's what they mean by intentionality. And that has been an influential definition of consciousness. But in my own work and in this presentation, I've not really defined consciousness that way, but it could be a case that most conscious states are intentional. For example, uh, the visual perception, the perceptual states are always perceptions of something, or when I think, I always think about something. The definition I want to use is not really that. I mean, I just want to sort of broadly define it as any state which has a what it is like feel. Um, it may so happen that most of these states or all of these states are intentional, though there is a lot of body of research which says that there are non-representational and in some sense non-intentional states of uh, consciousness as well, especially research that delves into altered states of consciousness or spiritual experience and mystical experiences, which say that there are states, mental states, where we don't seem to be representing anything. And that has, in some sense, a part of it also draws from this whole Advaitic tradition of non-dual experience of or experience not really being anything of this non-duality. There is no subject object, so intentionality always assumes an object because it's an object that is represented. So there seems to be that research. So there is a challenge to this whole definition project of defining consciousness as essentially intentional, though as you say it has been extremely influential. Intentionality is seen as the mark of consciousness or mark of the mental. And going to your first question of does intentionality is always agential? It would seem so, because if somebody, there is all for there to be a representation, there always needs to be at least a minimal representer who we can call the agent. More broadly, your question could also be understood as for any experience, is there always an experiencer? So it would seem that any experience is always for a subject, and hence there is an experiencer. But does this mean that the experience and the experiencer are two different entities, or are they? Can they be understood as one? Is a further question. It's a different question, but in short, it would seem that all experience is always for the experiencer, and all intentionality is always for somebody representing, or if you want to call it an agent, it's always for an agent.
Right. Thank you, Siddharth, for that comprehensive answer. So I think with that we are coming to the end of the session, and if you have further queries, we will be opening the
Available on WhatsApp.
Yeah, so please do put up your questions there and your responses, your feedback. We look forward to all of that. So our WhatsApp groups will be open shortly. So thanks again, Siddharth, for that very interesting lecture. We, like I mentioned earlier, miss you around here at NIAS.
Thank you, Mia, for your warm words.
Conversations that we have. And thank you, Dr. Sankita Menon, for conceptualizing these Friday lectures so that young scholars can come around and speak about academic endeavors. So thank you, ma'am. And thank you, Niharika and Team CSP for always being here, Ashwini, Abhishek, all of us who are here. Thank you, all of you. And also thank you, participants, for being the wonderful audience that you are and always turning up for the Friday lectures with interesting questions and comments. So thank you, everybody. We will see you around again.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, that'll be all.
Thanks, Siddharth. Thanks, Mira.
Thank you.